Welcome to Public Policy Square. I'm Manette Sorensen, a fellow at the 16th Council. I have here joining me today Dr. Brian Rubin, the founder and executive chairman of the 16th Council. Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Today we will be discussing the retaliatory tariffs imposed by China on the United States in response to Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods. Firstly, I wanted to start by discussing the United States tariffs that were imposed on Chinese goods. These were driven by a desire to increase domestic manufacturing in the United States. So I wanted to ask, what would be the benefits of increasing domestic manufacturing in the United States?
Well, reviving domestic manufacturing provides several strategic and economic advantages. First of all, it provides economic security and supply chain resilience. So that means it will lead to a reduction in dependence on foreign suppliers, that the U.S. can maintain production, ensuring that the U.S. can maintain production even during global disruptions such as pandemics or geopolitical conflicts. The COVID-19 crisis exposed vulnerabilities in the U.S., reliance on Chinese-made pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, and electronics. So, secondly, it also leads to job creation and economic growth. A return to domestic manufacturing generally boosts employment in high-wage sectors, particularly in industries like steel, semiconductors, and defense production. In that whole, manufacturing also has a multiplier effect. For every job created in manufacturing, several more jobs emerge in related sectors such as logistics, sales, and services. And then thirdly, is national security and strategic independence. So dependence on China for key industries, for example, rare earth minerals and semiconductors, pose risk in case of conflicts or trade disruptions. By restoring productions, the U.S. reduces the risk of economic blackmail by adversarial powers. And lastly, is strengthening innovation and industrial competitiveness. A strong manufacturing sector fuels technological advancement, and that ensures that research and development translate into real-world application rather than just being outsourced to foreign competitors. So by prioritizing domestic industry, Trump's trade policies are attempting to reverse decades of industrial decline and make the U.S. self-reliant in key sectors. Those will be my thoughts on this.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And do you believe that this new policy would be effective in increasing domestic manufacturing? Are tariffs the way to go for the United States to kind of spur this shift?
Oh yes, with some caveats. Rising costs of Chinese imports force businesses to seek alternatives, either by producing goods in the US or shifting supply chain to other nations. Secondly, higher import costs create a competitive advantage for domestic producers, allowing them to expand operations. Thirdly, it's investment in the US manufacturing increases as businesses anticipate long-term policy shifts. But there are challenges that must be considered. One of them is short-term costs may rise for consumers and businesses that rely on cheap Chinese imports. And some industries take time to adapt, as building new manufacturing infrastructure is not immediate. Until the businesses may shift production to third-party countries like Vietnam, for example, India, or even Mexico, rather than the United States. So despite these challenges, however, I think that there are clear signs that supply chains are diversifying, and many industries are going to bring production back to the US.
In your article, you mentioned that in the past, China has benefited from trade deals that allow it to dominate global supply chains, while it simultaneously imposes restrictive measures on foreign companies within its borders. Why do you believe that past United States leaders have not imposed tariffs on China or addressed these trade terms? Why is it that it isn't until Donald Trump's presidency that these tariffs have been imposed?
Okay, why I believe that past US leaders have imposed tariffs on China. So past leaders prioritize economic globalization and engagement with China because I believe that they thought that economic ties would encourage political reforms. And dealing with China is pretty difficult actually. So this approach led to some strategic miscalculations. And one of them is misjudgment of China's intentions. US policymakers assume that integrating China into the global economy, for example, the WTO, would lead to market reforms and liberalization. Instead, China exploited free trade rules by maintaining state-controlled economic policies, creating an imbalance. And secondly, is that it is about corporate interest and the influence of Wall Street influence. Now, many US companies benefited from cheap Chinese labor and outsourced manufacturing, leading to resistance against tariffs. Wall Street investors also profited from China's economic rise, discouraging political action. Now, the third thought there is Trump's policy shifts. So, unlike previous leaders, Trump viewed China as an economic competitor rather than a partner. Now, his administration recognized that China's unfair trade policies, including IP theft, subsidies, currency manipulations, were undermining the US industries. So Trump's tariffs were a strategic shift aiming at restoring the US economic leverage. And let's just be clear, this isn't the first time that a US president is imposing tariffs on a country which they consider a threat to the survival of their domestic industries. The 1861 tariff, for example, made it targeted British companies that were exporting cheap products into the United States. So that tariff made it possible for the US companies to compete, get them the space to grow. So these are my thoughts on that. This is why some past US company presidents haven't followed this route. And Trump's now doing something very different because of his perspective, generally.
So we can see that China responded to Trump's policies by imposing retaliatory tariffs and increasing restrictions on American businesses operating in China. What was the initial goal of these tariffs?
Now, here are my thoughts. China's tariffs were designed for probably three reasons, perhaps. The first I can easily identify is to exert pressure on Trump politically by targeting U.S. export industries, such as agriculture in states that supported it. Now, second is to deter countries from aligning with U.S. trade policies by signaling that economic retaliation would follow. And third, I believe, would be to maintain dominance in global trade by resisting US efforts to restructure supply chain. However, China's response, I believe, will backfire, as it did before, right? And as US businesses and farmers adapted to new markets, while China-owned economy suffered losses. So I believe that at this time as well, I see those policies, backfiring. But the goals, I believe, are these three that I mentioned. First of all, to exert pressure on Trump politically, and then to deter other countries from aligning with US trade policies by signaling that they will also retaliate. And thirdly, maintain dominance in the global trade by resisting US efforts to restructure supply chain. Those are the reasons I think that China decided to retaliate.
So you mentioned the intended outcome of these new policies, what China meant to do with their tariffs, compared to the reality of the consequences that these might have on the country. So what do you believe will be the consequences of these tariffs on China?
Oh, okay. There'll be slower GDP growth, and there's going to be supply chain diversification, with companies moving production to other countries like India, Vietnam, and there'll also be reduced foreign investments as companies see China as a riskier market. Those will be it, in my opinion.
And as we see in global value chain shifting, we also see their geopolitical role might be shifting in the upcoming years. You mentioned China's Belt and Road Initiative, particularly its role in Latin America and how the dynamic may now be changing with the United States seeking to have a stronger presence. So what do we see changing in Latin America related to China and the United States and their respective roles?
Okay. What we see changing in Latin America. First of all, you see what happened in Panama with the Panama president deciding to end the agreements with China on BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So China has used debt-driven infrastructure to gain influence in Latin America. However, with the US shifting focus to economic countermeasures, many Latin Americans will have to reconsider their reliance on Chinese investments. What we see with Panama, for example, as I mentioned earlier, is that Panama quickly realized that US will be a better partner than China. That's why they want to end the contracts, the agreement regarding BRI. So that I see a shifting focus, really. I see Latin American countries reconsidering their relationship with China. So I say that this is going to shift things, the way things are geopolitically.
And then my final question, I wanted to discuss alternative options for China. So in your article, you mentioned that economic superpower cannot adjust to changing trade environments will suffer consequences if it cannot adapt to these. So rather than impose these retaliatory tariffs, what could China have done differently, or what could China do differently in shaping its trade relationship with the United States under a Trump presidency?
Yes, you see, China made a huge mistake, a very serious mistake by by all the actions they've taken, including taking the US to the World Trade Organization. Because you see, the US hosts the cards, really. And China has a lot of options that they could have considered. For example, China could have decided to open its market for fair competition. And by reducing trade barriers, that's an option. Because the key thing here is let there be fair trade. That's really what Trump has been talking about. All right, be fair. Don't manipulate your currency and all of that. So they could have opened their market to fair competition. Secondly, China could have engaged in real trade negotiations to address the U.S. concerns, right? So it could have chosen to engage in negotiations rather than imposing tariffs. And thirdly, China could diversify its economy away from export dependency. You see, if you do that, you won't even need to, impose tariffs because you don't even depend on exports that much. So those are options. Those are things that the Chinese government could have considered, but they didn't do that. And I think that the path they have chosen is very tricky. It's going to have the Chinese economy is already weakening. It's weak already. It's weakening, and this part is going to just do more harm to that. So I do think that these are options that were available, which they should have taken, but they didn't do, and that's bad for China. Very bad for China.
Do you have any concluding thoughts?
Okay, yes, I do. Okay, so the world is shifting, really, and America is winning. China is making the biggest economic mistake of our time. President Donald Trump has played his cards masterfully, really, and this is reshaping global trade and forcing China into a position of weakness. While critics doubt him, Trump's bold strategy demonstrates Trump's approach Trump's approach is clearly one that holds advantages for the United States. And for decades, China has taken advantage of weak US trade policies. They flooded the US markets with cheap goods and manipulated global trade. Other presidents may have let that happen, but Trump isn't letting that happen. And it is important. What he's doing is important. His tariffs on Chinese goods is a statement that, look, there's no more free rides, no more one-sided deals, right? This is what this is about. And I believe that it's important that trade is fair. It's important that countries carry out their trades in a fair way that benefits everybody. And this is not the first time this kind of thing is happening. I did mention that in the course of earlier, that there have been a time when a tariff was set out to protect the US industries from Great Britain, and it did work just very well. This time it is about China, and I believe it holds strong opportunities for the United States. So those will be my concluding thoughts, that this will play a strong and important role in reshaping global trade and strengthening the US economy. China is making a mistake, but it's not yet late to reconsider the options that I did already mention earlier and follow a path that will actually work rather than retaliatory measures.
Thank you. That was incredibly insightful. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm Annette Sorensen, a fellow at the 16th Council. That was Dr. Brian Deepen, the founder and executive chairman of the 16th